Your Excellencies and honoured guests. Good afternoon. I am Mark Kenny, as has been said, from the ANU's Australian Studies Institute. And of course, I'm a former press gallery journalist for a long time. So just up the hill there for a couple of decades. And my expertise, such as it is probably a little more at home in the field of domestic Australian politics, but obviously with some international implications often, as is the case with covering federal politics. That said, it is my very great honour to be moderating this discussion today with these excellent people that we have arranged here for this discussion and for this very serious topic, the situation in Myanmar. I was going to start, obviously, with Janelle Saffin, the state MP, who is a former federal MP as well, and who has a very strong interest in this area and played a very constructive role. But unfortunately, she's, as has already been said, unable to be here today. So I'm going to ask Dr. Marcus Brand from IDEA, the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance. He's the head of program Myanmar and a very considerable expert in this area. So I might just get you, Marcus, to, I suppose, step into the breach there and set the scene in the way that Janelle Saffin, you had intended that she might.
Thank you very much. And of course, it will be impossible for me to do justice to what Janelle would have said here, but I will nevertheless try to sort of chart the way to actually this exercise in sense-making of what has been happening in Myanmar over the past 2 years and how exactly to situate the institutions that we are having in front of us, such as the NUCC, the CRPH, and others. And I would therefore like to just recap quickly. Many of you are very familiar with this story, of course, but for the benefit of everybody in the audience, of how we got here. And of course, the significant date here was the 1st of February 21, the day when the newly elected parliament was supposed to convene in Naypyidaw, when the military decided to arrest the president of the country, the state councillor, and a number of other senior officials, and to basically detain the elected members of parliament who had been getting up to get ready to go to parliament to be sworn in the guest houses in Naypyidaw, and told them to stay put and that there won't be a parliamentary session. And then simply physically occupying the government buildings in Naypyidaw by force. I was in Naypyidaw at the time, and it was a big shock to everybody around us, in the team also. And ever since then, we have been trying to make sense of this new situation. But one thing that was also very clear for us at International IDEA was the unconstitutionality of what the military did. And I want to emphasize this because in the military's own narrative, what they were doing was the implementation of a state of emergency provision of the 2008 Constitution. But it is very important to understand that even the 2008 Constitution, which had originally been drafted by the military, that had preserved a very strong political role for the military, such as 25% of the seats in parliaments at the union and state level, control over the security sector ministries, and essentially a veto power over constitutional amendments. Even that 2008 Constitution did not give the military a carte blanche to take over power at will. But that is, in a way, how the military has been presenting this. But the one, let's say, feature that they missed when they put this 2008 Constitution together was that they did not expect that there would ever be an elected president in place who would refuse to sign up on a state of emergency that would hand over power to the military. So in order to jump over that, they simply took out the elected president and arrested him. He's still in detention, and put in their own deputy president as the acting president, and then set up the state of emergency regime. And this is important to emphasize because that means this unconstitutionality at the very source of this military regime is still the ground for its illegality and illegitimacy, because it has not been possible or able to repair this unconstitutionality. And I'm saying this because in some historical situations, you also see that coups succeed, especially here in the Asia-Pacific region. You can all think of a number of countries where coups actually are successful and are eventually accepted through acquiescence by the population and by the international community. But it is important to understand that this has not been the case in Myanmar. In Myanmar, there has been an immediate society-wide rejection of this coup. And also the international community has not acknowledged this, or at least not fully acknowledged or legally, officially acknowledged this change of power. So what we have in Naypyidaw is still an illegitimate regime that is not formally legally recognized by any other government to be the government of Myanmar. And instead you have, and that is also different from many other situations, you have an elected parliament. And there I need to go back a little bit to November 2020, when the last general elections were held, that returned actually the majority of the NLD, the National League for Democracy, led by Aung San Suu Kyi, which had been the dominant party in the parliament since 2016, which again won something like 80% of the elected seats in the new parliament, both at the union and state level. And it is those MPs, that elected parliament, that were ready to come to the parliament building on the 1st of February, but were physically prevented from doing so. After a few days of shock and bewilderment, there was an initiative among some of these MPs to say, well, we will convene and constitute ourselves anyway, regardless of this military coup, and we will choose to exercise the mandate that we were given by the people. And so they convened and set up a committee representing the Pyidaungsu Hluttaw, which means the Union Parliament, originally with 16 members, now 20 members, that were mandated by basically all of the elected members that were around, something that represents something like 80% of the elected members of parliament. So they have this full mandate to represent the parliament of Myanmar, and they have been holding on to this mandate ever since. Of course, they were very quickly also persecuted for this and for the opposition against the military, and many of the MPs have also been arrested. Some have even been tortured and targeted for all kinds of abuse. And until now, the CRPH is actually operating, we can say, in the underground or in whatever possibility they find in areas that are not controlled by the military. Some of them are outside of the country, but essentially they, you could say, online parliament through Zoom calls, where they even have had a number of, I think up to now, 4 full sessions of the Union Parliament, with something like 300 members participating in a Zoom call, hearing reports from the National Unity Government, taking strategic decisions, and also passing legislation. And it is that CRPH that became the, let's say, core body of these, what we call now the legitimate interim institutions, by first of all adopting the first version of the Federal Democracy Charter, setting up the National Unity Government in April last year, as was already said, and then significantly forming, together with the other appointed representatives of the people, this National Unity Consultative Council. And that is really a very interesting body that brings together the elected representatives from the elections with the appointed or legitimate representatives that have other sources of legitimacy than an election, namely civil society groups, the civil disobedience movement that represents something like 400,000 civil servants who refuse to take orders from the military, the strike groups that have been organizing the mobilization on the streets, youth groups, women's groups, but also ethnic resistance organizations and the political parties. And it is these groups that have come together to then negotiate the new version of the Federal Democracy Charter. I'll come to that a little later, more in detail, but essentially it's those institutions that can claim representative legitimacy from the people, first of all, because of the valid election result, but also because of the diversity of representation that they have built through the National Unity Consultative Council. And that is why Dr. Thun is right, that this is quite unprecedented in the sense that it is the most diverse and inclusive and representative setup of institutions that Myanmar has ever seen. And as I already mentioned in the Federal Democracy Charter, a number of principles have been agreed. I'll speak about that a bit later. And this is the significant aspect of this really is that there has been not only a rejection of the military coup, but also a rejection of the 2008 constitution, which has therefore lost its legitimacy, and we would no longer consider the legal basic law of the country, but that has created something like a constitutional vacuum, and this opening for a new constitution building process that we have been supporting. And what's significant about this is that we don't only see a structural change or let's say constitutional change, but there has also been a change in the political culture from a culture of coercion that has characterized the military regime for decades to a culture of consent, which is of course much more difficult to achieve consensus among diverse groups. And that is why, it's sometimes also a bit confusing and frustrating to follow the decision-making in these bodies. But the consensus is to continue to talk until there is an agreement, even among wide group of stakeholders. So this winner-takes-all mentality that has also characterized the previous parliament has been replaced with a collective decision-making, consensus-building approach that now sort of shapes the approach of these interim institutions. And that's already sort of all to get us started. But the last thing I would like to say is that as International IDEA, as an intergovernmental organization, we have taken a very clear position from the beginning of condemning the coup as unconstitutional and illegitimate. And we have been working very closely with these interim institutions that we consider the legitimate representatives of the country. We have been doing this work only from outside of Myanmar for the past year or so. But we continue to work not just in terms of capacity building and advice to the institutions, but also helping them to follow this path laid out in the Federal Democracy Charter, which is the roadmap towards a new constitution, which we will now hear about from Minister Sakong, and that we can also discuss more a bit later.
Thank you, Dr. Brand, for that really, I think, very good and comprehensive explanation of the institutional landscape that is emerging, that has been adduced out of this crisis and which is emerging through that highly collaborative process, which offers hopefully a way forward.